In this short video, we're going to look at 3 different types of seams, and then we're going to look at how to finish some of those seams. The first one we're going to start with is just a normal straight seam, which is just a standard seam, and usually we would do this with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. So to show you how that works, take your fabric. Now on your machines you do have lines which will tell you different size spacings, so it's much easier for you to line up and try and keep your seams nice and straight. So there is a line for 1 centimetre seam allowance. I'm going to just follow that. If you want to pin your seam first, then that's absolutely fine, then you can do that. So we turn our machine on, go backwards and forwards initially just to set those stitches, and then follow that 1 centimetre seam line on your machine, and that will help you keep that allowance nice and smooth and even and straight. And at the end, just make sure you finish off going backwards and forwards. Snip your threads. And then obviously you would go to the iron and you would iron that seam. Usually you iron it open like that, but you might iron it to one side depending on where the seam is and what you need it to be doing. So that's just your straight seam. The next one we're going to look at is a French seam. Now a French seam you tend to use for finer fabrics, or for fabrics or garments, I should say, that you're not necessarily going to line. So a French seam is an enclosed seam, and rather than the other way, which was that we started with our right sides together to do our seam, for a French seam you do that in reverse. So we start off by having our wrong sides of our fabric together. So in other words, you're seeing the outside of the fabric facing you. Now for a French seam, your seam allowance is a little bit more. So you really need to give yourself at least 1.2 centimetres clearance for that seam. So once you've got your seam edges together, you can just pin that in place to help you keep that nice and even. Now I'm going to sew just 0.5 in from my edge for the first seam. And again, as I said, on your machine you should have a marking that will tell you where the 0.5 setting is. So turn your machine on, make sure you go backwards and forwards to start with, usual for all your sewing, and then go down your 0.5 seam allowance. Okay. Once you've done that small seam, you may feel that you might want to trim that down even more, so it's more like a 0.3. Now you can do this, just take your time, obviously don't cut into your stitches, try and get that as even as you can. So there you can see, I've just taken off a tiny amount. Now we're going to turn our fabric over. Now at this point you could iron this flat, it might help you, it's entirely up to you. So effectively now we're going to put our right sides together as we would have done if we'd sewn the seam normally. Then I'm going to turn it over. Now we really want to make sure that that's nice and crisp and against that sewn edge. And then I'm just going to put my pins in, just so I know I've got that even. But as I say, if you iron that, you'll actually find that is a lot easier to keep that nice and flat. So the purpose of the next stitch line is to encase the raw edges of that little tiny seam you've just created. So that's why this is really good for very fine fabrics, which you may find difficult to stop those from fraying. So this is just a nice, neat way of doing that. Okay, so now that's done, I'm now going to sew that on the 0.5 line. So hopefully I've encased my little one that I've already made. So again, try and make sure you go nice and straight and you're staying on that line. You could go up to as much as 0.7 for this seam. So between 0.5 and 0.7, depending on how much you've left for this seam allowance. Okay, once you've done that, take that out, turn the machine off. So now you have your little encased seam on the wrong side where it should be, and on the right side should be absolutely fine and straight and look exactly like a normal seam would do. So that's our French seam. So obviously you would then iron that and make that look nice. Seam I want to show you is a fell seam. Now a fell seam is quite a strong seam, and it's used really for sort of denim garments or workwear garments or outerwear garments, things that need a very sort of strong and specific looking seam. This seam will have 2 stitches on the right side, and on the wrong side it will just have 1 line of stitching. Okay. So the seam allowance for a fell seam would be at least 1.5, maybe even 2 centimetres, depending on your garment and your fabric choice. So you need to make sure that you've given yourself that amount to play with. And again, like with the French seam, I've got my right sides out, and together initially I've got my wrong sides. So I'm going to do my first stitch line as I did with all the others, but this time I'm going to do it on my 1.5 or 2 centimetre seam allowance line, depending on what you've left. So again, you'll see that you've got a line on your machine that will help you to guide that. If you're not sure, just take your tape measure, make sure you're on the right one, and then that's going to work nicely. Also for a fell seam, I tend to use a slightly longer stitch. So on my machine, I've just changed that up to a 3mm stitch. Again, try and keep that nice and straight all the way down to the end. Now once you've done that first seam, we're now going to trim one side of that seam allowance. So on this side, I'm going to trim that down to 0.5. So again, you might want to mark that, or if you can just make sure that you know what that is. So I'm now going to trim just that one side. So I've trimmed that seam. Now I need to go to the iron. Iron that so that seam will lie flat, and I also want to iron under the edge of that seam 0.5, so that when that is then turned and sewn, that will actually be my 1 centimetre seam of my fell. Okay, so let's go over to the iron. So at the iron, I'm now going to iron this fell seam over. So I'm going to do that first. So that's ironed over where I cut the other side of the seam. But now I also want to iron under that edge. So that's going to help me when I sew that in place. So just be careful doing this. Don't use the steam when your fingers are going. Don't use the steam when your fingers have gone away, because I don't want you to burn yourself. The steam is incredibly hot. So you can just take your time. Ironing that edge over, like so. All the way up. Finally, the last bit. So there, that's now going to make that a lot easier to sew, because we've got that nice and even, and that's all tucked under and ironed, and this is the right side of your garment. So now we're going to go back to the sewing machine and just sew that line in place. Okay, now I'm going to pin my fell seam down so that I know that's all going to stay in the right place. Now for some denim garments you might use a top stitch thread to do this top stitching of this seam, which gives you a nice finish if it's something like denim jeans or a jacket. But it's fine to use ordinary thread too. Okay, so really I just want to make sure I'm sewing just inside that edge of that seam, so I catch that nice correctly. Take your time so you get it nice and straight. So there you have your fell seam. So you've got your 2 lines of stitches on the right side of your garment, and on the other side you will just have your 1 line of stitching, and that's your fell seam. So those are the 3 seams I'm going to show you today. All the details of these seams that I've shown you you'll find on our Canvas fashion pages. So there's one for seams which is the plain and the French, and there's also one that will help you there with the fell seam. There's also a welt on that one as well, which is a slightly different version. So those are all there for you to look at as well. Okay, now we're going to look at some of the finishes you might want to do for some of your seams. the first thing I'm going to do is to show you how to make some bias binding tape. And a good way of finishing some of your seams is to edge them with a bias binding like this. If you want a 1 centimetre biased tape, you will see that it's actually folded in half 4 ways. So you've got one fold there, then that folds and that folds. So that's your 1 centimetre. But in order to make that, you've actually got to cut out your fabric. When you open it up, that's actually 4 centimetres. So that's what we've got to learn how to make the tape first. So the reason it's called bias tape, bias binding tape, is we actually cut the fabric across the grain line of your fabric. And that's sometimes called cutting on the bias. So that part of your fabric will be the stretchiest. So if you can see that, when you move that across the grain line, that's stretchy. And your bias tape needs to have that little bit of give, and that will help you go round shapes and just make that really easy to use. Now obviously you can buy this, but it's really good if you can make your own, because then it's either out of the same fabric that your garment is going to be made out of, or you wanted something contrasting, so it's really good to learn how to make this first. So here's my fabric, and here's the selvage edge, so that's where my grain line runs down. But as I said, I want to be able to cut my pieces, cut the bias sections I'm going to make my tape out of. In order to do that, you need to take the bottom edge of your fabric, take it up against the grain line, so you've ended up with a 45-degree angle to that grain line, and that's our bias, our stretch. That's across the grain, and that's where we're going to cut our bias tape. Now it does tend to shift a bit because now it's on the bias, it's not quite so stable, so do be careful when you're marking and cutting these out, because they can shift a little bit. So as I said, I need, for my 1 centimetre seam tape, I need 4 centimetres of fabric. So I take my pattern master and I'm going to measure my 4 centimetres. And I'm just going to go along, making that mark all the way along the line of my now 45-degree fold. So depending on how long or how big you're going to make these strips, I tend to then use my long meter ruler, and now I can measure up those marks that I've just made, and then I can draw my line, and I know I've now got the size of my tape that I want. So again, when you're cutting this, as I say, it does tend to move around a bit, so using one of the weights, the fabric weights, just might help you. So because that's a folded edge, I'm now going to carefully cut that. So this one marking will actually give me 2 pieces of tape. So just cut that all the way up the length of your tape. And then once I've done that and I'm happy, then I can then cut on that line to create my tape. So continue that all the way along, and then you'll end up with 2 pieces of your bias tape. So here's one that I've already cut out. Now we've obviously got to go to the iron, and we've got to iron our tape so that it looks like that. You actually also, depending on how you're going to use it, you might just want to iron your tape with the 2 edges ironed over. So I'm going to show you 2 ways of using this. So one way or the other. So if you find it difficult to work out the actual measurements, what I've done is using my pen that comes out on an iron so it doesn't leave a mark ultimately. I've marked my centre line on this particular one, And then I'm going to go to the iron, and that will help me when I go to turn under my two edges, that I will get those correct and that they will line up to the middle. And so that's what we're going to do next. So now we're at the iron, and as I said, we've got that centre line. I've just marked that just to help me while I fold over and iron the edges. So just going to take the edge of my tape and I'm going to line it up with that centre line, just with the iron. Carefully just fold that. Make sure you don't use the steam button when your fingers are there, because obviously that's going to be very dangerous. And so then now I can just continue along, making sure I'm lining up the edge of my tape with the centre line. So you do that all the way along, and then once you've done one side, then we're going to start and turn over the other side. So again, line it up, and then carefully as you go along, you can make sure you're folding that over, and that will line up. Once you've done that and you're happy with it, then you could give it a little steam afterwards, and that will seal that nicely. Now if you're now wanting that to fold over again, then obviously that's just a question of doing that last fold. And again, you're just going to use the iron to press that. But as I say again, if your fingers are there, make sure you're not pressing that steam button until you're happy. Then you can steam it once your fingers are away. So eventually, once you've done all that, you will have had your tape nicely ironed. Now let's look at how we're going to use this tape. So let's look at a couple of ways we could use our bias tape to neaten the edges of our seams. I'm going to take the one that I've ironed over, so we've just got a 1 centimetre left. And to do this, usually this is to bias tape the seam, but I'm going to have the seam closed. So it's not going to be open like that, I'm actually going to close it. So the easiest way to do that is to just take your seam and then take your bias tape, and you're going to make sure that the edge of your seam allowance is on the inside and up as close and as far into the binding as you can go. And then I'm just going to fold that over and put my pin in place. So I'm going to continue that down. So again, you need to make sure that the edge of your seam allowance is absolutely in and up against the edge of the tape. So we do that all the way along, making sure so hopefully if you managed to iron your tape nice and evenly, that the 1 centimetre on this side is also the same as 1 centimetre on that side. So when we sew that, we should catch both edges of the tape nicely. So on my machine, I am just going to try and sew just inside towards the tape, just inside of that edge of the tape. So we're just going to catch both edges nicely. Take your time, try and get that nice and straight. If that is spare, then I would trim that, depending on what you're going to do next. But once you're happy with that, that should be sewn, and then hopefully you've caught the edge on the underside as well. And then you would give that a nice press, and you would press that seam to one side or the other. And that's one way of neatening a seam with bias tape. So the next way I want to show you is if you want to have your seam open like this, then you want your seam to be edged in bias tape on both sides. So for that, I've got my bias tape, but I haven't actually ironed it completely folded over like the first one. I've left it open like that, and that will make it easier to sew in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the seam so that I'm underneath the seam, and I'm going to take the edge of my tape, so this is the right side of my tape if you like, and it's actually going to go against that underneath side of my seam. And again, just pin that in place. So take your time, make sure those edges are nice and even together. That's just the bottom bit. There we go. Now to sew this, we need to make sure all the fabric is out of the way and that all we're sewing is that seam and the bias tape. And because I ironed it, you've got a nice crease line there, and that's where I'm going to sew down, so that will help you guide your stitches. So making sure the other side of the garment is out of the way and not underneath, otherwise it won't work. So again, continue down that bias tape. Make sure you don't drift over too far, otherwise you will catch the actual garment fabric, and then you have to unpick it and start again. So we've got to the end. So if I open that up, hopefully you can see that that is just attached on that one side. Now all we need to do is fold over the other side, and that will just cover the stitching that we've just done. So again, making sure you've got the underside of your fabric or your garment out of the way, then you can pin it in place. So again, we're only going to sew through that side of the seam. This can look very effective if you're using a contrasting coloured fabric. Might give a really nice detail to the inside of your garment, as I say, especially if you're not going to, you wouldn't line this, but it would give you a really nice feature to the finishes of your seam. Okay, so keeping everything out of the way. Again, I'm only just sewing just inside of that tape, so I'm just maybe 2 mil away from the edge. Take your time, get that nice and straight. So now on the one side of our seam we have that nicely edged with the bias tape, and then we would just repeat that on the other side. So you take another section of your bias tape and you'd repeat that by sewing it onto the underside first, and then you'll fold it over and top stitch, and then both sides, both edges of that seam would be nicely bound. So that's another way of using bias binding. The last finish I want to show you is just to top stitch your edges. So if you don't want to use bias tape and really you're just going to want to top stitch the edges of your seam, then all you're going to do for that is you just fold under the edge of that seam and you could pin that. So effectively you've folded under 0.5 of your seam, and again you can go all the way down the length of your seam. Again, if you want to, it would make it a lot easier. If you do this, you could just iron that under, and then that way when you come to sew it, it won't move around too much, and then you might find that a lot easier. Okay, so that side is all done and it's folded under, and then you would repeat that and do that on the other side. So again, making sure that it's just the other side of your seam, and then that you would do the same thing, you would fold and pin that. So I'm just now going to sew this first one. So again, making sure that both sides of your fabric is out of the way, so you're just sewing on the seam allowance. So again, you're really just sewing 2 or 3 mil in from that edge. And that's just so you can do a nice little top stitch along that seam salvage. So there you have a nice little top stitched edge with your selvage folded under, and that will again give you a nice neat finish to your seams. So obviously, as I said, you would then do the other side, and that gives you another alternative for your seams. Finally, I just want to show you how to hem. Now, if this was the end, say this was the end section of my shirt, for instance, and this is the bottom edge, I will have left maybe, say, 2 centimetres or 2.5, whatever size you want your hem to be. So that's going to allow then for me to create a hem. So the first thing I've done is I've actually ironed over 1 centimetre. So that's 1 centimetre of my 2 centimetres I've left for my hem edge. So I've done that because that just makes it much easier than to fold over. So obviously you would have neatened all your seams first before you hem. Hemming is one of the last things you would do on your garment. So now I'm going to turn that over, following that 1 centimetre, so that's the other part of my 2 centimetre hem line. And I'm also making sure that as I'm folding that over, that line of my seam is all lined up nice and neatly and is in the right place. I tend to start there just because that way I know that when I get to that point, everything is going to be lined up correctly. So turning under 1 centimetre over that 1 centimetre that I've ironed, and that will give me a nice finish, nice hem to my garment. I'm just going to change that pin now because I actually want to sew down that way, if you see what I mean. So your pin should be facing away from the way you're going to sew. Makes it easier for you to take your pins out as you go along. So finally to the end. So that's now going to create a nice hem, and I've got no raw edges, so that's made that nice and neat. And again, I'm just going to do a top stitch line on that, again about 2 millimeters in from the edge of that folded over hem. But again, these sizes are entirely up to you, and it does depend on your garment. You might actually want a hem that's 5 centimeters deep or 3 centimeters deep. It is entirely up to you and what design you're creating. So again, as always, try and keep that nice and straight, nice and even as you go. And there you have a nice hem to the bottom of your garment. Okay, so you'll also find on our Canvas pages there is a step-by-step guide to binding seams. So that's the 2 versions that I've just shown you. So there's lots of resources there for you to see. Hopefully that will help you with your seams and your seam finishes.